Tonight, my listeners, we follow a hush that fell over familiar roads when fear traveled faster than messengers, and even strong walls felt unsure of themselves. From the north came footsteps Rome had not learned to ignore, and the city listened as its confidence wavered. Stories like this survive because they were whispered, not proclaimed. If you wish to, you can rest here and quietly take part. Take a moment to let us know how you're doing down below in the comments. And liking the video and subscribing helps this reach other people of the same interest and use. Now, let the fire sink low, the streets empty, and the night draw long and still around you. Welcome to a story from the early 4th century, before our era, when Rome was still just one city among many on the Italian peninsula. Ambitious, yes, but hardly the empire it would become. Tonight, you'll follow the journey of a Celtic war band, led by a chieftain named Brennus, as they descend from the Po Valley toward a confrontation that nearly erased Roman history before it truly began. Settle in. Let your mind drift back to a world of hill forts and sacred groves, of bronze shields catching morning light, and of a city that almost vanished entirely. You might picture ancient Italy as Roman territory, but that's the story written by victors who came much later. In the early days of the 4th century BCE, the peninsula was a patchwork of peoples who would have laughed at the idea of Roman dominance. The Etruscans still controlled wealthy cities to the north, their painted tombs holding secrets of a civilization that had been trading with Greeks and Phoenicians when Rome was just a cluster of huts on 7 hills. Greek colonies flourished along the coasts of the boot of Italy, particularly in places like Tarentum and Syracuse, where philosophers engaged in debates under colonnades, and merchants counted coins imprinted with images of gods and heroes. These were not mere frontier outposts, but sophisticated urban centers that prided themselves on being as civilized as Athens or Corinth. They had been in these colonies for centuries, long enough that they no longer referred to their homeland as home. The Samnites held the mountainous interior, tribal peoples with their federations and warrior traditions. They fought in loose formations, were familiar with every path through the Apennines, and showed no interest in Roman expansion. To the south and west, the Volscian Aequi had been skirmishing with Rome for generations. Not grand campaigns, but the kind of grinding, seasonal warfare that defined borders one burned village at a time. And Rome itself? You would undoubtedly recognize the 7 hills, yet the city was still struggling to establish itself following the expulsion of its last king and the declaration of its independence as a republic. The Forum wasn't yet paved with marble. The magnificent temples and aqueducts existed only in the prayers of priests who hoped future generations might afford such luxuries. Rome's territory extended perhaps 25 miles from the city in any direction, enough to feel substantial to Romans themselves, but barely a footnote to anyone else. The city's great achievement, the one thing that set it apart, was stubbornness. Roman armies had been defeated plenty of times, their settlements raided, and their harvests burned. Yet they kept coming back, kept rebuilding, and kept insisting they mattered. It was almost endearing in a way, like watching a determined child who refuses to accept that older siblings might be stronger. That persistence would eventually reshape the Mediterranean world, but in 390 BCE, it just seemed like admirable foolishness. North of Etruscan territory, beyond the Apennine Mountains, lay the Po Valley, a different world entirely. Here, Celtic tribes had been settling for more than a century. migrating down from lands that would later be called Gaul and building communities along the rich river systems. These weren't primitive peoples, despite what Roman historians would later claim. They worked iron skillfully, bred horses that Greek cavalrymen envied, and maintained trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. The Celts brought their gods, their own social structures, and their ways of marking time and memory. They built hill forts with sophisticated defenses, produced artwork that would survive in museum collections 2,000 years later, and maintained oral traditions that could trace genealogies back through dozens of generations. They also brought a warrior culture that celebrated individual prowess in combat, where reputation mattered more than territory, and a good death in battle ensured a comfortable afterlife. These Celtic settlements in northern Italy were not really invading forces. They'd been there long enough to establish farms, to argue with neighbors about boundary stones, to complain about the weather just like any other Italian farmer. But they maintained connections to tribes farther north, and young men still crossed the Alps seeking fortune and glory, the way ambitious youths have always sought their fortunes away from home. The Etruscans had learned to coexist with these northern neighbors, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, sometimes marrying their daughters to Celtic chiefs in the eternal game of diplomacy. Roman knowledge of the Celts was hazier. They'd encountered Celtic mercenaries in Etruscan armies and had heard travelers' tales about the tribal peoples beyond the Apennines, but direct contact had been minimal. The mountains formed a natural barrier, and Rome had enough problems with closer neighbors. In 391 BCE, the Etruscan city of Clusium, modern Chiusi, if you are familiar with Tuscan geography, became involved in a local dispute that occasionally escalates into something larger. Celtic tribes were pushing south, looking for better farmland, or perhaps just pushing, because that's what young warriors do when they're restless. Clusium, feeling threatened, did what smaller powers have always done when faced with danger. It looked for allies. The delegation from Clusium traveled south to Rome, presenting their case to the Senate. They spoke of barbarian hordes, an exaggeration certainly, but fear has a way of inflating numbers, and asked for Roman intervention. This put Rome in an awkward position. Help Clusium, and Rome might antagonize these northern peoples about whom they knew almost nothing, refuse, and they'd look weak, which could embolden those closer neighbors who were always testing Roman resolve. The wisdom of the Roman Senate led them to choose a middle path that satisfied no one and pleased everyone, a hallmark of committee decisions throughout history. They'd send ambassadors to investigate the situation and mediate if possible. 3 members of the prominent patrician clan, the Fabii family, volunteered for the mission. They were young, ambitious, and probably saw the assignment as a chance for glory with minimal risk. Ambassadors, after all, were sacred under all civilized codes. Their individuals were inviolable. What none of these Romans understood, what they couldn't understand, really because they lacked the context, was that the Celtic tribes didn't necessarily share Roman assumptions about diplomatic immunity or appropriate behavior for ambassadors. The Celts had their codes, their sense of honor, and their ideas about what constituted an insult worth answering with a sword. The stage was set, though no one realized it yet. The actors were moving into position, reading from scripts written in different languages, heading toward a collision that would nearly erase one of history's most consequential cities before it had a chance to become consequential at all. And at the center of the approaching storm stood a Celtic chieftain whose name would be remembered in Rome for centuries. Brennus. Brennus was not originally his real name. Brennus was a title that meant something like king or leader in the Celtic languages, the equivalent of Caesar in later Latin, a word that started as a name and became a position. But history recorded him as Brennus, so Brennus he remains, leading a confederation of Celtic tribes that Roman sources would lump together as the Senones. The Senones weren't a unified nation in any modern sense. Celtic society organized itself around extended family groups and tribal affiliations, with temporary alliances forming around charismatic leaders for specific purposes: a raid, a migration, or a war. Brennus had somehow convinced several tribes to follow him south, which tells you something about his persuasive abilities, if nothing else. Getting Celts to agree on anything was like herding cats, if the cats were heavily armed and had strong opinions about honor. Picture the war band that gathered under Brennus's leadership. Not an army in the Roman sense, with standardized equipment and formal ranks, but a loose collection of warrior groups, each following its own sub-chief, each maintaining its own identity. Some wore mail shirts, expensive items that marked wealth and status. Others made do with hardened leather, or simply fought bare-chested, trusting to speed and the protection of their gods. Most carried the distinctive Celtic shield, tall, oval, and decorated with swirling patterns that looked random, but held deep cultural meaning. Their weapons varied too. Long, slashing swords designed for mounted combat or for a fighting style that prioritized reach and intimidation. Spears of different lengths, some for throwing, others for thrusting. Those who favored direct approaches to problems were equipped with axes and hammers. A few even carried the carnix, a war trumpet shaped like an animal head that produced a sound described by one Greek historian as hair-raising, which probably undersells it, honestly. The carnix was designed to terrify, and by all accounts, it succeeded. These warriors wore their wealth openly, gold torques around their necks, bronze bracelets on their arms, and intricate brooches holding their cloaks. Appearance mattered in Celtic culture, where a warrior's reputation depended on witnesses and storytellers. You wanted people to remember you, to describe you accurately when they recounted the battle around fires later. That meant looking distinctive, looking impressive, and looking like someone worth singing about. The war band moved south through the Apennines in late summer or early autumn. The sources aren't precise about dating, but the timing matters because it explains what happened next. Summer campaigns were normal in the ancient world. You fought when roads were passable and armies could forage off the land. But late summer meant harvest season was approaching, and armies got nervous about being far from home when crops needed gathering. Brennus's stated objective was straightforward enough. The Celts wanted land. The Po Valley was getting crowded, or so they claimed, and better farmland lay to the south. Whether this was genuine demographic pressure or just a convenient excuse for a raid that turned into more is debatable. The line between migration and invasion has always been blurry, and people's stated motivations rarely capture the full complexity of why they do things. The band crossed into Etruscan territory without much organized resistance. The Etruscans, like most civilized peoples, preferred to let their cities handle their defense rather than maintaining standing armies. Individual cities might hire mercenaries or call up militias, but coordinated responses to external threats weren't really their style. This strategy worked fine when threats came from other cities engaged in the same civilized game of limited warfare, but it left them unprepared for people playing by different rules. Clusium, watching this armed migration approach, panicked in the understandable way of cities that suddenly realize they're in someone's path. They appealed to neighboring Etruscan cities for help, got vague promises of support that meant little, and then made their desperate embassy to Rome. This led the three Fabii brothers to travel north to investigate and mediate the situation. The meeting between the Roman ambassadors and Brennus probably took place near Clusium, possibly with Etruscan mediators present to facilitate translation. Not all Celts spoke Latin, and certainly not all Romans spoke Celtic languages. The sources are frustratingly vague about details, but they agree on the outcome. Things went badly. According to Roman accounts, Brennus explained his people's position clearly enough. They wanted land. Clusium had land. Perhaps Clusium could share some land, and everyone could avoid unpleasantness. This offer was presented as more demand than request, but still, it opened negotiations. The three Fabii brothers, displaying either courage or catastrophic stupidity, replied that Rome had no authority to give away Etruscan land, and perhaps Brennus should consider that starting wars was unwise. The discussion grew heated. Words were exchanged that probably sounded more insulting in translation than they were meant to be. The eternal problem of diplomatic discourse conducted through interpreters. Then, according to Roman sources, fighting broke out between the Celts and the Clusians. This is the pivotal moment in the story. The three Fabii brothers, oblivious to their role as ambassadors and their supposed neutrality, took up weapons and joined the Clusians in their battle against the Celts. One of the Fabii, Quintus Fabius Ambustus, killed a Celtic chief in single combat. This was presented in Roman accounts as heroic, a demonstration of Roman virtue and martial prowess. From the Celtic perspective, it was an outrageous violation of sacred hospitality and diplomatic protocol. You don't invite someone to negotiations and then have them kill your people. That's not how civilized peoples behave. Brennus demanded that Rome surrender the Fabii brothers for punishment. This was the appropriate response under Celtic law. The offenders should face justice for their crime. The request reached Rome, where it created a political crisis. Surrender the Fabii, and Rome would look weak, bowing to barbarian demands. Refuse, and Rome would be breaking its principles about the sanctity of ambassadors and appropriate punishment for crimes. The Roman Senate debated, and here's where class politics entered the equation. The Fabii were patricians, members of Rome's elite, closely connected to other powerful families. The common citizens, the plebeians, had their assembly, the tribal assembly, which also held power to make certain decisions. Unwilling to punish fellow patricians, the Senate delegated the decision to the tribal assembly, likely in the hopes of diverting popular anger elsewhere. Instead, the tribal assembly did something that probably seemed clever at the time, but would prove catastrophically short-sighted. They elected all three Fabii brothers to high office for the coming year, making them military tribunes with consular power. This made them effectively untouchable under Roman law, while simultaneously giving Brennus his answer. Rome was not only refusing to punish the Fabii, it was rewarding them. News traveled north slowly, carried by messengers who probably understood they were delivering a declaration of war, even if the words never said so explicitly. Brennus received the message, consulted his sub-chiefs, and made his decision. If Rome hadn't provided justice, he'd march south and take it himself. The war band, which had been mostly interested in Etruscan farmland, now had a new target and a new motivation: revenge for an insult and punishment for oath-breakers. The Celts turned south, moving out of Etruscan territory and toward Roman land. Behind them, they left nervous Etruscan cities that were perfectly happy to let Rome deal with the problem it had created. Ahead lay the Tiber River, and beyond that, a city that had no idea what was coming. You have to imagine the journey from the Celtic perspective to understand what happened next. For Brennus's war band, this wasn't an invasion of a great power, it was a punitive expedition against a city that had violated sacred customs. Rome, from their viewpoint, was just another Italian settlement, probably not that different from dozens of others they'd seen. The fact that Rome would someday rule most of the known world didn't matter because that future hadn't happened yet. Right now, Rome was just the place where those oath-breaking ambassadors lived. The warband moved through the Tiber Valley in loose formation, spread out because feeding 30,000 people, the number Roman sources usually cite, though it might be inflated, required foraging across a wide area. They weren't trying to hide their approach. Stealth wasn't really a Celtic virtue when it came to warfare. You wanted your enemies to know you were coming, to have time to think about your reputation and get properly afraid. Roman scouts brought news of the approaching force, and the Senate called emergency sessions to debate response strategies. They had several options, none of them good. They could retreat behind Rome's walls and endure a siege, hoping the Celts would get bored or run out of supplies and go home. They could try diplomacy again, though that had worked so well the first time. Or they could march out and meet the Celts in open battle, gambling that Roman discipline could overcome whatever advantages the northern warriors might possess. Rome chose battle, which tells you something about the Roman mindset, even at this early stage. Retreating felt like admitting defeat before fighting even started. So they mustered the legions, or what passed for legions in those days, before Roman military organization became the well-oiled machine that would conquer the Mediterranean. Every able-bodied male citizen within specific age ranges had military obligations, and the Senate called up approximately 15,000 men in total, though the actual number may have been fewer. These Roman soldiers were citizen farmers first and warriors second. Depending on their wealth class, they provided their own equipment, resulting in a diverse army comprising both well-armed, wealthy citizens and impoverished individuals with limited resources. They drilled together a bit and knew basic formations, but combat experience varied wildly. Some were veterans of the endless small wars with neighboring tribes. Others had never swung a sword in anger in their lives. The Roman commanders decided to meet the Celts at the Allia River, a tributary of the Tiber about 11 miles north of Rome. The logic was sound enough. Force the battle at a river crossing, use terrain to limit Celtic maneuverability, and prevent them from reaching Rome itself. It was the kind of defensive strategy that should work against a disorganized barbarian horde, assuming you believed Celts were disorganized barbarians. The problem was that Celtic warriors, while they fought as individuals rather than in disciplined units, weren't stupid. They'd been fighting for centuries, using tactics that worked for their style of warfare. More importantly, they were highly motivated. The mission wasn't a casual raid anymore. This was about honor, about justice for a murdered chief, and about showing that you couldn't mock Celtic customs without consequences. The date was July 18th, 390 BCE, or at least, that's when Romans later commemorated the disaster. The battle that followed was less a battle than a rout, and it happened so quickly that sources struggle to explain exactly what went wrong for Rome. The Celts apparently charged, screaming war cries and blowing those haunting Carnix trumpets, and the Roman line simply broke. Understanding why requires thinking about what ancient combat actually felt like, which is challenging because most of us have never experienced anything like it. Imagine standing in formation with a shield and spear, watching thousands of warriors charge towards you screaming. They're not neat ranks like you've been trained to fight against. They're individuals, yes, but individuals who know exactly what they're doing, who've trained since childhood for this moment, who genuinely believe dying well in battle is the best possible fate. The psychological impact of a Celtic charge was substantial. They looked terrifying. Many fought bare-chested or painted, trying to maximize the intimidation factor. They sounded terrifying. All those war cries and trumpets designed specifically to unnerve opponents. And they came fast, not in measured steps, but in an all-out sprint that closed distance before you had time to think about being afraid. The psychological assault was more effective than any tactical maneuver for inexperienced soldiers and farmers who had been given weapons just a few days earlier and told to defend Rome. The Roman left flank broke first, probably because it was positioned on a hill, and the Celts wisely attacked it first to seize the high ground. As soon as a portion of the line faltered, panic rapidly spread. Soldiers started running, and running became acceptable when you saw that everyone else was running too. The Roman right flank, closer to the river, made a slightly better showing. They actually fought long enough to take casualties before breaking. Some retreated to the Tiber and tried to swim across, drowning in their armor or swept away by currents. Others ran for Rome, hoping the city walls would provide safety. A few hundred managed to retreat in better order to Veii, an old Etruscan city that Rome had captured just a few years earlier. Brennus's warriors pursued, but not with the organized determination of a professional army chasing a beaten foe. Celtic culture emphasized individual glory, which meant warriors stopped to strip the dead, to claim trophies, and to argue about who killed whom. This disorganization gave many Romans time to escape, though it probably didn't feel like mercy at the time. The battle, if you can call it that, was over in hours. Rome had lost most of its army without inflicting significant casualties on the Celts. The road to the city lay open, defended by nothing more substantial than panic and prayer. Cavalry scouts, who had watched the battle from safe distances, brought news of the disaster to Rome before the survivors did. The city erupted in controlled chaos, the kind of panic that comes from knowing something terrible is happening, but not quite knowing what to do about it. The Senate convened immediately, because that's what the Senate did in crises, even when they had no good options to discuss. Rome in 390 BCE was not the marble city of emperors and triumphal arches. The circuit of its walls enclosed an area that would feel modest compared to later imperial Rome, though it was still substantial for its time. The walls themselves proved sufficient to withstand the typical tactics of Italian warfare, which included brief sieges, limited equipment, and army retreats after a few days. Against a motivated enemy willing to camp outside indefinitely, they'd be less impressive. The Senate made quick, brutal decisions. The elderly, children, women, and men unfit for combat would evacuate to nearby Caere, an Etruscan city that had maintained friendly relations with Rome. This wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatism. Fewer mouths to feed meant a besieged city could hold out longer. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses who maintained Rome's sacred fire and guarded important religious objects, would take the most precious ritual items and flee as well, some to Caire, others to other safe locations. A small garrison would remain in the Capitoline Hill, the most defensible of Rome's 7 hills, where temples to Jupiter and other gods stood. If necessary, they would fortify themselves there, safeguarding Rome's spiritual core, even in the event of the city's collapse. The rest of the surviving soldiers would scatter to Veii or other strongholds, hopefully to regroup and counterattack later. In the chaos of a city bracing for the worst, they made these decisions in hours. Families grabbed what they could carry: food, valuables, and religious objects. The evacuation roads were clogged with refugees moving south and east, away from the threat coming from the north. The elderly, who couldn't keep up the pace, were left behind or chose to stay, preferring to face whatever came rather than die exhausted on some roadside. Meanwhile, Brennus and his war band moved south at their pace, taking time to strip the battlefield properly and tend to their wounded. Despite the rout, the Celts had suffered casualties in the battle. Some Romans had fought before breaking, and even a panicked man with a spear could find luck. Celtic culture took care of its wounded warriors because they were valuable, both for future fights and for the stories they could tell. The war band probably expected Rome to be defended. Cities usually were, and that's where the real fighting would happen. Sieges, assaults on walls, the grinding work of actually taking a defended position. So they approached cautiously, scouts ranging ahead to identify fortifications and defensive positions. What they found was a nearly empty city. This had to be confusing. The Celts had just won a great victory. They'd routed an army, killed enemies, and proven their might. The normal response would be for the defeated city to surrender, or at least prepare for a desperate defense. Instead, Rome was largely deserted, lacking any organized defense or delegation to negotiate terms. It was simply silent. The emptiness was eerie in a way that full resistance wouldn't have been. Empty cities can mean traps, ambushes, or desperate last stands waiting around corners. The Celts entered Rome carefully, probably expecting trouble at every turn, finding instead abandoned homes, empty markets, and the occasional old person who'd stayed behind by choice or necessity. According to Roman accounts, which should be taken with appropriate skepticism, since they were written by the defeated to explain their defeat, the Celts were impressed by the old men who'd stayed behind, sitting in their formal robes on the porches of their houses like living statues. One Celtic warrior supposedly reached out to touch an old man's beard, checking if he was real, and the Roman struck him with his ivory staff. This incident triggered violence, and the old men were killed, though the story was probably invented later to give those deaths meaning and dignity. The Capitoline Hill, though, remained defended. The garrison there had closed the gates and prepared for siege, and the Celts, surveying the fortifications, decided it wasn't worth the casualties a direct assault would require. Celtic warfare preferred quick victories and individual glory, not grinding siege operations that favored defenders and discipline. So they settled in to wait, occupying the rest of Rome and hoping the garrison would surrender once food ran low. These tactics created a strange situation. The Celts controlled Rome but didn't really know what to do with it. They weren't an occupying army with administrative experience. They were warriors who'd come for justice and revenge, and they'd achieved that simply by taking the city. Now what? They couldn't stay forever. Summer was turning to autumn, and no one had planted crops back in the Po Valley, which meant people back home were going to be hungry if this war band didn't return to help with harvest. The siege of the Capitoline settled into routine. The Celts camped in Rome's forums and streets, probably treating the whole thing as an extended festival. Celtic culture loved feasting, storytelling, and drinking, and they had plenty of all three. The Romans on the hill watched and waited, rationing food and hoping for relief that wasn't coming. Days became weeks. The Celts found Rome's wine stores, always a dangerous discovery for an army that values drinking, and helped themselves to the city's wealth, which was modest but still substantial by their standards. Some warriors got bored and went looking for additional glory, raiding nearby Roman territory, or fighting the scattered Roman forces trying to regroup at Veii. One raiding party discovered Caere, where Roman refugees had fled. Here's where the story gets intriguing, because Caere chose to protect the refugees rather than hand them over. The choice was significant, an Etruscan city deciding that protecting Romans mattered more than appeasing the Celts. Rome, with its power to reward friends and punish enemies, would remember that decision later. For now, though, it just meant the Romans at Caere survived. The garrison on the Capitoline grew hungrier, food stocks dwindled, and the Celts showed no signs of leaving. The strategic stalemate wasn't sustainable, but breaking it required someone to make the first move, and neither side quite knew how to do that in a way that preserved honor while achieving objectives. According to Roman tradition, the Celts tried to take the Capitoline by stealth, attempting a night climb up the hill's steepest face, the cliffside that defenders had considered impassable. The attempt nearly succeeded, and would have if not for Rome's sacred geese. The temple of Juno kept a flock of geese as sacred birds, and these geese, apparently taking their religious duties seriously, raised such a racket when the Celts approached that they woke Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, one of the garrison commanders. Manlius rallied defenders, and they threw back the assault by pushing Celts off the cliff and dislodging their ladders. The story is almost certainly embellished. Sacred geese, as Rome's saviors, makes for better storytelling than guards happen to be alert. But it became a foundational Roman legend. Whether geese were actually involved or not, the assault failed and the siege continued. But now both sides were getting desperate. The Romans on the Capitoline were genuinely starving, reduced to eating leather and whatever else could provide calories. The Celts were getting restless, worried about problems back home, and increasingly aware that staying much longer risked disease in the crowded city. This period is when negotiations probably began. Which side initiated them depends on whose account you believe. The terms were straightforward. Rome would pay the Celts to leave. This moment wasn't surrender exactly, more like purchasing peace, which was actually a common enough practice in the ancient world. Warriors could take gold home, which was almost as valuable as glory, and definitely more useful for buying things. The agreed price was 1,000 pounds of gold, a staggering sum that would require Rome to scrape together every bit of precious metal it could find. The Capitoline garrison sent messengers to Caere and other refuges, calling in debts and donations from Rome's allies, and anyone who'd benefit from Rome continuing to exist. Slowly, painfully, the gold was gathered. The payment ceremony, according to Roman sources, did not go smoothly. The Celts brought scales to weigh the gold, but the Romans accused them of using false weights, trying to cheat them into paying more than agreed. An argument erupted, with both sides accusing the other of bad faith. Then Brennus, in a moment that would become infamous, threw his sword onto the scales along with the weights, adding its mass to what Rome had to pay, and spoke 3 Latin words: Vae victis, woe to the vanquished. It was an eloquent summary of ancient geopolitics. The losers didn't get to complain about fairness. The defeated didn't get to negotiate from strength. You paid what the victors demanded, or you kept fighting and hoped for better odds. That phrase, Vae victis, would echo through Roman consciousness for centuries, a reminder of humiliation and a promise that Rome would never be in that position again. Roman sources add a final twist to the story. They claim that just as the gold was being weighed, Marcus Furius Camillus arrived with an army from Veii, the Roman survivors who'd been regrouping and recruiting. Camillus supposedly interrupted the payment, declared that Rome ransomed itself with iron rather than gold, and drove the Celts from the city in a massive battle. This part is almost certainly fiction, added later to give the story a properly heroic ending. Camillus was a real person and a real Roman hero, but the timing was too convenient, too Hollywood perfect to be credible. What probably happened is simpler and less dramatic. The Celts took their gold and left, satisfied they'd achieved their objectives of avenging the murdered chief and punishing Rome's arrogance. But Vae victis was real, or at least became real, in Roman memory. That humiliation, that moment of complete helplessness, burned itself into Roman cultural consciousness. Later, Romans would claim they never paid the gold, that Camillus saved them at the last moment, because admitting they'd bought peace from barbarians was too shameful to accept. The truth, though, was probably that they paid every ounce of that gold, sword weight and all, and counted themselves lucky to survive. The Celts departed Rome, heading north with their gold and their glory. They'd achieved everything they came for: vengeance for a murdered chief, proof that Rome couldn't violate sacred customs without consequences, and enough precious metal to make everyone wealthy back home. From their perspective, their mission was a completely successful raid. They had successfully taken control of a significant Italian city, demonstrated the Celtic military's dominance, and left a lasting legacy of songs. They had no way to know that they'd just created Rome's origin trauma, the event that would define Roman foreign policy and military strategy for the next 400 years. They couldn't predict that this ransomed city would grow into an empire that would eventually conquer their homelands and erase their cultures so thoroughly that we still struggle to understand Celtic society today. In 387 BCE, the warriors were simply satisfied as they headed home with gold and good stories. Rome's refugees returned to find their city ransacked but intact. The walls still stood. The Capitoline temples survived. The sacred objects and the Vestal virgins were safe. Yes, they'd lost wealth and pride and a whole lot of soldiers, but the city endured. They could rebuild. They could recover. They could make sure this never ever happened again. The warband's departure was probably anticlimactic after everything that came before. They didn't march in formation or follow a single route north. Instead, groups of warriors drifted away over days or weeks, heading home with their share of the gold and whatever portable wealth they'd claimed from Rome. Celtic armies rarely maintained formal cohesion once their immediate objectives were achieved. Warriors returned to their tribes, their families, and their farms that needed tending. Brennus himself disappears from the historical record at this point, which is frustrating but typical for Celtic leaders. The Celts maintained oral traditions rather than written records, and those traditions focused on deeds rather than chronological biographies. Brennus probably lived out his life as a respected chieftain in the Po Valley. honored for leading a successful raid against Rome, possibly fighting in other conflicts, and eventually dying in some manner that seemed important to his people, but wasn't recorded for posterity. Some of the warband apparently stayed in Italy, rather than returning north. The sources mention Celtic settlements expanding after the Roman raid, suggesting that warriors decided the Italian climate suited them better than wherever they'd come from originally. These settlers integrated slowly into the Italian landscape, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through continued conflict with Etruscan and Roman neighbors. Rome would eventually conquer their descendants during later wars of expansion, gradually absorbing their Celtic identity into Roman culture. The gold itself had an interesting fate, assuming Roman traditions can be believed. Later, Romans claimed that the gold paid to Brennus was recovered shortly after the Celts departed. Sometimes they said Camillus's army caught the Celts and defeated them. Other times they suggested the gold was found abandoned, and other times they were vague about details. Their claim was almost certainly wishful thinking. The gold was gone, spent, or melted down, or distributed across Celtic communities from the Po Valley to Gaul. But admitting they'd permanently lost that wealth to barbarians was too painful, so Romans invented stories where justice was done and proper order restored. This is common in national mythologies. The painful parts get edited, softened, and given redemptive endings that make the trauma bearable. The truth that Rome had been utterly defeated and had saved itself only by paying ransom couldn't be accepted as history's final word on the matter. Back in the Po Valley and the Celtic lands beyond, Brennus's raid became legendary in the way successful military adventures always do. Songs were sung about it, probably for generations, though none survived to be written down. Young warriors would have heard the stories and thought about how they might achieve similar glory someday. The raid validated Celtic military practices, suggested that the supposedly civilized Italian cities were vulnerable, and encouraged the belief that southward expansion was both possible and profitable. These events had long-term consequences that Brennus couldn't have anticipated. Celtic raids into Italy continued sporadically over the next century, never quite reaching Rome again, but keeping the northern frontier unstable. Partly the cause was opportunism. Once you know raiding works, you keep doing it. But partly it was cultural momentum. The success of Brennus's expedition became an example that other chiefs tried to replicate, with varying degrees of success. The Celts maintained control of the Po Valley for another century, building their settlements, raising their children, and fighting occasional wars with Etruscans and Romans and each other. Because Celts were perfectly capable of fighting among themselves when external enemies weren't available, they remained militarily formidable, their warrior culture producing soldiers that Mediterranean powers sometimes hired as mercenaries. Celtic warriors fought in Sicily, in Greece, and even as far east as Anatolia, carrying their distinctive shields and their reputation for ferocity wherever they went. But the balance of power was shifting in ways not immediately apparent. Rome's near destruction had taught lessons that Celtic culture, ironically, couldn't learn from its victory. The Celts had proven they could defeat organized armies and sack cities, but they hadn't developed the systems for converting military success into lasting political dominance. They won battles, but didn't build empires. They dominated regions, but didn't create administrative structures to govern them. They were brilliant at war and terrible at everything that came after war. The Po Valley Celts eventually faced Roman expansion in the late 200s and early 100 BCE. By that time, Rome had transformed itself into a military machine, specifically designed to prevent another Brennus situation. The legions that conquered the Po Valley were nothing like the panicked militia that broke at the Allia River. These were professional soldiers, veterans of wars in Italy and beyond, backed by a state apparatus that could sustain campaigns for years if necessary. The wars were brutal and extended. Celtic warriors still fought with individual courage and skill, but courage couldn't overcome systematic, disciplined Roman strategy backed by superior logistics. Roman armies didn't quit when battles went poorly. They didn't go home for harvest season. They kept coming, kept replacing losses, and kept pressing until organized resistance became impossible. By 191 BCE, the Romans had largely subdued the Po Valley Celts, incorporating the region into what would become Cisalpine Gaul on this side of the Alps. The Celtic inhabitants were killed, displaced, or assimilated. Their languages gradually gave way to Latin. Their customs merged with Roman practices or disappeared entirely. The distinctive Celtic culture that had produced Brennus vanished from Italy within a few generations, leaving behind only place names and archaeological remains. The broader Celtic world beyond Italy fared no better. Julius Caesar would conquer Gaul in the 50s BCE, writing about Celtic tribes with a mixture of respect for their warrior virtues and contempt for their political disorganization. The Celts of Britain would hold out longer, but eventually succumb to Roman conquest as well. By the time of the Roman Empire's height, Celtic cultures survived only in remote regions where Roman control was too expensive to maintain: Ireland, the Scottish Highlands, and parts of Wales. Brennus's gold, if any of it survived intact, was probably melted down and reused long before Celtic cultures disappeared from Italy. Gold is too useful to leave in its original form when you need coins or jewelry or tribute payments. The physical metal dispersed into the general circulation of precious metals in the ancient economy. Its connection to that pivotal raid was forgotten by everyone except the Romans, who remembered it all too well. The refugees returned to find a city violated but viable. The walls stood mostly intact, though Celts had torn down or burned sections to provide easier access. Despite their ransacking and the theft of valuables, most buildings survived. The temples on the Capitoline were damaged, but repaired. It could have been worse. It almost had been worse. Rome still existed, which under the circumstances qualified as a victory. The rebuilding happened quickly, maybe too swiftly for proper planning. Streets that might have been straightened were rebuilt following their old winding paths. Buildings went up where they'd stood before, regardless of whether that made urban planning sense. There wasn't time for grand redesigns when everyone needed shelter before winter. As a result, the city grew organically and inefficiently, adhering to medieval patterns that would endure for centuries, frustrating subsequent emperors who attempted to impose order on the chaotic maze. But the physical reconstruction was almost secondary to the psychological rebuilding. Rome, after Brennus, was a city determined never to be helpless again, and that determination reshaped everything. The military reforms took precedence and progressed swiftly. The army that had broken at the Allia River was obviously inadequate, so Rome began transforming its citizen militia into something more professional, more reliable, and more capable of standing against the kinds of threats the Celtic raid had represented. Training became mandatory and regular. Citizens learned to fight in formation, to hold position under pressure, and to execute complex maneuvers as units rather than as individuals. The equipment was standardized so that repairs and replacements could be managed efficiently. Discipline was enforced ruthlessly because discipline had been precisely what failed at the Allia River. An army that couldn't be panicked, that wouldn't break and run, became the goal, and eventually the achievement. Rome also reassessed its foreign policy. The old approach of responding to threats case by case, making alliances as convenient and breaking them when expedient, had left Rome isolated when it needed help most. The new approach emphasized reliable, long-term alliances backed by genuine military support. When Rome's friends faced threats, Roman legions would march to help, partly from genuine loyalty, partly because having allies created strategic depth that might prevent enemies from reaching Rome itself. The city's defenses received attention too. The walls were rebuilt stronger, with better gates and more defensible towers. Guard posts were established on approaches to Rome, providing early warning of any future threats. Roads were improved, not just for trade, but to allow rapid military response. The lesson that geography mattered, that controlling approaches to Rome meant controlling threats to Rome, became foundational to Roman strategic thinking. Perhaps most importantly, Rome became aggressive in ways it hadn't been before. The old Rome had been ambitious but reactive, expanding when opportunities arose, defending what it had, but not systematically seeking to dominate its neighbors. The post-Brennus Rome was different. The post-Brennus Rome actively aimed to control territory, subdue potential threats before they materialized, and establish a security zone around itself to prevent another surprise attack. This aggression manifested first against Rome's immediate neighbors. The Volsci and Aequi, long thorns in Rome's side, faced campaigns of subjugation instead of the old pattern of seasonal raiding. Roman armies didn't just defeat enemy forces anymore. They destroyed enemy capacity to wage war, seized territory, established colonies, and created layers of control that made future resistance increasingly difficult. The Etruscans, who'd been dominant in central Italy when Brennus came south, found themselves gradually overwhelmed by Roman expansion. City by city, sometimes through war and sometimes through coerced alliances, Etruria became subject to Rome. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Etruscan independence was mostly a memory, their cities subordinate to Roman power, their culture beginning the long process of assimilation that would eventually erase it almost completely. But all this expansion created new problems. Larger territory meant longer borders to defend, which meant larger armies, which meant more resources devoted to military affairs. Rome developed systems to handle this, roads to move troops quickly, colonies to serve as military outposts, and alliances structured so that subject cities had to provide soldiers for Rome's wars. The emergence of the security state was not exactly tyrannical, but it undoubtedly prioritized military power as the solution to most problems. Rome's near destruction also shaped a remarkably durable cultural narrative about national resilience. The story of Brennus became a founding myth, told and retold, embellished with each generation. The geese became sacred symbols, honored annually with ceremonies that reminded Romans of how close they'd come to extinction. The gold payment, which almost certainly happened, was gradually edited out of the official story, replaced by tales of Camillus's last-minute rescue. This myth-making served a purpose. It gave Romans a story about overcoming catastrophic defeat, about national survival through virtue and determination. It justified the military expansionism and the security obsessions by pointing to what happened when Rome wasn't strong enough to protect itself, and it created a permanent enemy archetype, the northern barbarian threatening civilization, that would persist through Roman history and beyond. Meanwhile, the actual Celts began to lose relevance. Roman propaganda turned them into generic barbarians, stripping away the complexity of Celtic culture and reducing them to convenient villains. The sophisticated metalwork, the elaborate social structures, the oral traditions that preserved genealogies and laws, all these aspects disappeared from Roman consciousness, replaced by images of naked, painted savages who represented everything Rome wasn't. This cultural transformation of the Celts from specific enemies to generic barbarians would have consequences for how Rome dealt with later Celtic peoples. When Rome eventually conquered Gaul, it did so with cultural assumptions shaped by Brennus's raid centuries earlier. Celts were dangerous, uncivilized, and untrustworthy. That's what 300 years of Roman cultural memory insisted, regardless of whether it accurately described the actual people being conquered. Here's the thought experiment that makes the Brennus raid fascinating. What if it had succeeded more completely? What if the Celts had not only taken Rome but also destroyed it, killed its population, and erased it completely, just as they would later be erased themselves? The counterfactual seems absurd because we know how history turned out, but at the time, it was entirely possible. A single successful assault on the Capitoline, an outbreak of disease in the garrison, or the Celts choosing to stay longer and eliminate Roman refugees, any of these scenarios could have transformed occupation into extinction. Without Rome, Mediterranean history becomes almost unrecognizable. The Italian peninsula would likely have remained fragmented between Etruscans, Greek colonies, Samnites, and other regional powers. Celtic settlements in the Po Valley might have expanded further south without organized opposition. The Carthaginians, who fought 3 wars against Rome and nearly won the second one, would have dominated the Western Mediterranean without serious competition. Or perhaps another Italian city would have risen to fill the power vacuum. The Etruscans had civilizations and resources. The Greek colonies had connections to the broader Hellenic world. The Samnites had the warriors and the territory. Someone would have eventually unified Italy, probably, because the economic and strategic incentives for unification existed regardless of which city accomplished it. But it wouldn't have been the same empire. Roman culture, with its specific mixture of Greek sophistication and Italian pragmatism, its legal traditions, and its administrative innovations, wouldn't have developed. The particular brand of military organization that allowed Rome to conquer and govern such a vast territory wouldn't have existed. If not for the Romans, someone else would have developed an alternative system, leading to a fundamentally different shape of European history. The languages we speak might be different. Latin became the foundation for French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, the Romance languages spoken by nearly 1 billion people today. Without Rome's expansion, Latin would have remained a regional Italian dialect spoken by a few 100,000 people, eventually absorbed into Etruscan or Celtic, or whatever language dominated Italy. Instead, modern Europe might speak languages descended from Etruscan, Carthaginian, or Celtic roots. Christianity's spread would have taken different paths. The Roman Empire provided the infrastructure and the political organization that allowed early Christianity to expand from a Jewish sect to a world religion. Without Rome, Christianity might have remained a Middle Eastern phenomenon, or spread more slowly through different networks, or competed differently with other religious traditions. The entire religious map of Europe and the Americas could be unrecognizable. But history did happen the way it happened. Rome survived, rebuilt, learned from its near destruction, and became the empire we know. Brennus's raid, rather than destroying Rome, ultimately made Rome stronger by teaching it what defeat felt like and how to prevent that feeling's recurrence. The traumatized city on the Tiber transformed itself into the dominant power of the ancient world, driven partly by ambition, but also by deep-seated fear that another Brennus might someday come south. Ironically, the Celtic peoples emerged victorious in the immediate conflict, but ultimately lost in the long run. They won the battle, sacked the city, took the gold, and went home satisfied with their success. But that success planted seeds of Roman determination that would eventually destroy Celtic independence across Europe. By the time of Julius Caesar, Rome had the military strength and cultural confidence to conquer Gaul and present it as bringing civilization to barbarians. This story erased the memory of Brennus's victorious warriors. The gold itself, that 1,000-pound-plus sword weight that bought Rome's survival, represents the ultimate historical irony. The Celts took wealth that probably meant less to their warrior culture than glory and reputation, while Rome received something that shaped its entire future trajectory. The gold could be replaced, and was, through Rome's later conquests. The humiliation couldn't be forgotten, and it drove Roman policy for centuries. So when you think about Rome, about the empire that shaped Western civilization, about the legions and the aqueducts and the roads, and the laws that influenced everything that came after, remember that it nearly ended before it really began. Remember that there was a moment when Rome was empty and vulnerable, when the Capitoline garrison was starving, and the city's future depended on geese and luck, and whether Celtic warriors would get bored and go home. Remember that history's grand narratives have pivot points where everything could have gone differently. The alternative worlds that might have been are ghosts haunting the reality that was, reminding us that nothing was inevitable until it happened. Rome's destiny as the eternal city was not predetermined by fate or gods. It was written in the traumatic memory of survivors who decided that never again would they be so helpless, so vulnerable, so close to extinction. And maybe, as you drift towards sleep, you can imagine that earlier Rome, smaller and more fragile, watching northern warriors occupy its streets and wondering if there would be a tomorrow. You can imagine the relief felt when the Celts finally left, the determination to rebuild that followed, and the slow transformation from being a traumatized victim to becoming a regional power and eventually an empire. History is long and complicated, but sometimes it turns on moments that could have gone either way. A battle by a small river, a night assault on a hill, a payment of gold that bought time for survival. The room is quiet now, and outside your window the world continues, built on foundations laid by people who never imagined where their decisions would lead. Rome survived its crisis and built an empire. The empire fell, but its language and laws and ideas persisted. We're all living in the echoes of that near extinction 390 years before the Common Era, when Brennus came south and Rome almost disappeared. Sleep well, knowing that history is full of moments like these, crisis points where the future hung in balance, where small choices had enormous consequences, where everything nearly went a completely different way. Rome's story is dramatic, but every culture has its near-death experiences, its formative traumas, and its moments when survival wasn't certain. We remember the ones who made it through, and we forget the ones who didn't. which gives us a distorted view of how inevitable anything really was. The Celts went home with their gold and their glory, satisfied with their raid, having no idea they'd created the monster that would eventually destroy them. Rome went back to work, rebuilding and planning and preparing for every possible future threat. And the two cultures, victor and vanquished, both headed toward destinies neither could predict from that moment beside the Tiber when gold changed hands and a city survived another day. Pleasant dreams, and remember, sometimes the most important victories are simply surviving until tomorrow. Welcome to a journey through mist and memory, where we'll walk together through the world of the Celts, a people who never built empires or conquered distant lands, yet shaped the very soul of Europe. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 800 BCE to the time of Christ, Celtic communities spread across the continent like wildflowers, each one distinct but connected by language, art, and a way of seeing the world that still whispers to us today. Let's settle in and travel back to a time before borders, before nations, to discover the gentle civilization that lived in rhythm with the land itself. You're standing in a clearing somewhere in Central Europe, and the year is around 800 BCE, though of course nobody's counting yet. The morning fog sits heavy between the oak trees, thick enough that you could almost believe it has weight. Somewhere in that fog, a cow lows softly, and you hear the distant clank of a bronze pot against stone. This is how the Celtic world begins. Not with a bang, not with armies marching, but with smoke rising from roundhouses and the smell of barley porridge cooking over fires that have been tended since before anyone can remember. The people here don't call themselves Celts, of course. That's a name the Greeks will give them much later, probably because they heard the word Keltoi somewhere and thought it sounded appropriately exotic. The people in this clearing would tell you they're simply the folk who live by the river bend, or near the old hill, or in the valley where the good clay comes from. What makes them Celtic, though nobody's putting it into words yet, is the way they've been doing things for generations. The language they speak rolls and lilts in a particular way. Their bronze smiths have been passing down techniques for making tools and jewelry that carry distinctive patterns, spirals and curves that seem to flow like water. When they bury their dead, they place certain objects in the graves, a favorite cup perhaps, or a beautifully made pin to fasten a cloak. Let's walk through this village with you. The houses are round, their walls made of woven hazel branches packed with clay and dung, which sounds unpleasant until you realize it's actually excellent insulation and smells mostly of earth and dried grass. The roofs are thick thatch, steep enough that rain runs right off. Inside, there's a central hearth that never quite goes out, even in summer, because starting a fire from scratch is tiresome work involving a bow drill and a lot of patience. The floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that get replaced when they start to smell. Smoke finds its way out through the thatch, mostly, though the interior of these homes always carries a pleasant wood smoke smell that gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your dreams. There's something deeply comforting about it. That scent feels as if safety itself has an odor. The family who lives here, let's say 5 or 6 people, maybe 3 generations, don't have much by modern standards, but what they have is well made. There's a loom in the corner where someone's been weaving wool into cloth with a checked pattern. The wool has been dyed with plants from the surrounding countryside, yellow from lady's bedstraw, blue from woad, and red from madder root. The resulting fabric is soft and warm and will last for years. Against one wall, there's a shelf with pottery bowls, some plain and practical, others decorated with simple geometric patterns. There are bronze pins for fastening clothes, maybe a few amber beads from the distant Baltic coast, and evidence of trade networks that stretch farther than you might think. In a leather bag hang herbs for cooking and healing. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated wisdom of generations, about which leaves help with stomach troubles, and which ones make the stew taste better. Outside, the village spreads in a loose cluster of similar roundhouses, maybe 20 or 30 of them. There are no straight streets, no city planning, just houses built where it seemed good to build them, near each other for company and safety, but not so close you can hear your neighbor's every conversation. Between the houses, children are playing a game that involves throwing stones at a mark drawn in the dirt, and they're arguing about the rules in that timeless way children have argued about rules since the invention of games. The fields beyond the village are small and irregular, following the contours of the land rather than imposing order on it. People here grow emmer wheat and barley, tend small gardens with peas and beans, gather hazelnuts from the woods, and keep pigs that forage in the forest. Cattle are wealth here. The more cows you have, the more important you are. But they're also deeply practical, giving milk, pulling ploughs, and eventually providing meat and leather. What you notice most, though, is the pace of things. Nobody's rushing. The smith works at his anvil with patient, practiced movements. The woman carding wool does so while chatting with her neighbor. Two men repairing a section of fence stop regularly to discuss the best way to do it, disagree amicably, try it one way, then shrug and try it another. There's time for everything, because time itself feels different when the sun and seasons are your only clocks. The Celts are emerging here in Central Europe, not because they invaded or conquered, but because groups of people sharing similar languages and customs have been living, farming and trading together for so long that they've become a recognizable cultural family. They're not a unified nation. That concept doesn't exist yet. They're more like cousins who live in different valleys, but recognize each other's accents and appreciate each other's pottery styles. Now we're moving forward a couple of centuries to around 600 BCE, and something important has shifted. You're in the same general region. Let's say what will one day be Austria, but the village has grown, and more importantly, it's working with a new material, iron. The discovery that certain stones, when heated in a very hot fire with charcoal, produce a tough metal that holds an edge better than bronze. This changes things. Not overnight, of course. Change is almost never overnight, despite what the history books sometimes suggest. But gradually, iron tools appear, plows that can break tougher soil, axes that can clear forests more efficiently, and swords and spearheads that are cheaper to make than bronze ones. You're watching a smith work, and there's something almost meditative about it. The iron has been heating in the forge for a while now, brought to a temperature where it glows orange-red. The smith pulls it out with tongs and begins to hammer, and each strike of the hammer is deliberate and purposeful. Sparks fly, which would be exciting except the smith barely notices them anymore. This is his daily work, this transformation of earth into tool. The thing about iron is that it's more common than the copper and tin needed for bronze. This means more people can have metal tools, which means more forest can be cleared, more land can be farmed, and more food can be grown. And more food means more people, which means bigger settlements, which means more organization is needed, which means some people start to become more important than others. This is how you get the rise of Celtic aristocrats, not through conquest or inheritance of divine right, but through the gradual accumulation of cattle, land, and the ability to host better feasts than your neighbors. In Celtic society, generosity is prestige. The person who can afford to throw a party where everyone eats meat and drinks imported wine, yes, they're already trading with Mediterranean peoples for wine, that person earns status and loyalty. Let's visit one of these aristocratic settlements, a hill fort that's been growing for generations. It sits on a prominent hill, naturally defensive, surrounded by ditches and ramparts made of earth and timber. Inside, there are still the familiar roundhouses, but some are larger than others, and the buildings are more densely packed. There's a communal area where people gather for festivals and markets, and the settlement of disputes. The chief's house is noticeably bigger, with more elaborate decorations. The doorposts are carved with spiraling patterns that seem to move in the firelight. Inside, the walls are hung with shields and weapons that are as much art as armament. Bronze shields with raised decorative bosses, swords with hilts wrapped in gold wire, and spearheads with intricate inlay work. But here's what's interesting. The chief isn't a king in the later European sense. He can't just order people around. His power comes from his ability to keep people happy, to mediate disputes fairly, to be generous with his wealth, and to throw those famous feasts. If he becomes tyrannical or stingy, people can simply leave and attach themselves to another chief. It's a surprisingly fluid system. The feasts are legendary, lasting days sometimes. Picture enormous cauldrons bubbling with beef stew, spit roasted pork, bread made from wheat that's been ground by hand, and honey mead in quantities that would make a modern person worried about everyone's liver. Musicians play harps and pipes. Poets recite long genealogies and stories of ancient heroes. People talk, laugh, argue, and occasionally fight, though fights at feasts are considered bad form and might get you banned from future gatherings. Celtic society at this point is organized into tribes, each with its own territory, and these tribes are further divided into extended family groups. Your identity is defined by your relationships, whose child you are, whose cousin, and whose client. There's a whole vocabulary for different kinds of relationships and obligations. If someone wrongs you, your entire extended family is obligated to help you seek compensation. If you wrong someone, your family helps pay the fine. This might sound restrictive, but it also means nobody faces the world alone. You're always embedded in a web of relationships, for better or worse. It's the opposite of the modern feeling of being an isolated individual, something that would seem utterly alien and rather sad to a Celt. The landscape is changing too. More forest is being cleared, more fields planted. But the Celts aren't trying to dominate nature. They're negotiating with it. Sacred groves remain untouched. Certain springs are holy. Some trees are so old and venerable that cutting them would be unthinkable. The land is full of spirits and gods, most of whom don't have temples or statues, but live in the rivers, mountains, and ancient oaks. By around 400 BCE, Celtic peoples are everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but spread across a remarkably large area, from Ireland in the west to what is now Turkey in the east, from southern Germany down through France and into Spain. This isn't because of some massive military campaign or organized migration. It's more like a slow diffusion, families and clans moving over generations, sometimes pushed by population pressure, sometimes pulled by the promise of better land or trading opportunities. You're traveling now, which in Celtic times means walking mostly. If you're lucky and wealthy, you might ride a horse or drive a cart, but most people experience Europe at walking pace, about 3 miles an hour, maybe 20 miles in a day if you're really pushing it. At this speed, you notice things. The way the light changes as you move from oak forest to open meadow. The sound of different rivers. The smell of the air in different regions. Let's say you start in what will become France. The Celts here will eventually be called Gauls by the Romans. The landscape is a patchwork of farmland and forest, with villages and hill forts scattered across the countryside. The people speak a Celtic language that your ancestors would have recognized, though the accent is different, and some of the words have shifted. You're welcomed in a village, because that's what you do. You welcome travelers. They're sources of news, entertainment, and trade goods. You're given food and a place to sleep, and in return, you share stories about where you've come from. This is how news travels in a world without writing or telecommunications, from mouth to mouth, village to village, slowly percolating across the continent. Moving eastward, you pass through regions where Celtic tribes have settled among other peoples, sometimes displacing them, sometimes intermarrying, and usually just living alongside them. The Celtic characteristic isn't racial or ethnic, it's linguistic and cultural. If you speak a Celtic language and follow Celtic customs, you're Celtic, regardless of who your grandparents were. In the Alps, you find Celts who have adapted to mountain life, building their villages on terraces, keeping goats and sheep more than cattle, and becoming experts at mountain passes that will still be used 2,000 years later. The mountain Celts have a reputation for being particularly tough and independent, which seems to be a universal characteristic of mountain people everywhere and always. Descending into the Po Valley in northern Italy, you encounter Celts who have settled in an area with a warmer climate than their ancestors knew. They've adopted Mediterranean crops, grapes and olives, while maintaining their Celtic identity. Some of them have started writing, using alphabets borrowed from the Etruscans and Greeks, though writing is still mostly for important inscriptions and accounting. The real knowledge, the stuff that matters, is still carried in people's heads and passed down orally. Further east, you reach Celtic settlements in what will become Romania and Bulgaria. These Celts have been here for generations now, and they've picked up influences from their neighbors, Thracians, Greeks, and eventually Dacians. Their art shows it, blending Celtic curves and spirals with local motifs. But they still speak a Celtic language and still organize their society in familiar ways. And then, remarkably, you reach Celtic communities that have settled in Asia Minor, in what is now central Turkey. These are the Galatians, who arrived here as mercenaries and warriors, but who have settled down to become farmers and craftspeople, like their Western cousins. They're surrounded by very different cultures, Greek cities, Persian influences, but they maintain their identity for centuries. What strikes you on this journey is both the diversity and the similarity. Each Celtic community has adapted to its local environment and neighbors, but everywhere you observe the same basic cultural patterns: the importance of cattle, the round houses, the spiral art, the elaborate metalwork, the bardic tradition of poets and storytellers, and the complex web of family and tribal obligations. You also notice what's missing. There are no Celtic capitals, no central government, and no empire. The Celts never developed the kind of political organization that the Romans or Greeks did. They remained a collection of tribes, sometimes allied, sometimes fighting among themselves, but never unified. This will eventually prove disastrous when faced with Roman military organization. But for now, in 400 BCE, it seems to be working fine. Why would you need a vast bureaucratic state when you have your tribe, your family, your chief, and your community? Let's slow down and spend some time in a Celtic household, because daily life is where culture really lives. Not in battles or politics, but in how people spend their ordinary hours. You wake before dawn in a roundhouse somewhere in Gaul. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to embers, giving off just enough warmth to take the chill off the morning air. Someone, probably whoever drew the short straw, metaphorically speaking, gets up to feed the fire, adding wood and blowing on the embers until flames catch. The smoke begins its lazy rise to the thatched roof. Breakfast is simple. Leftover bread from yesterday, maybe some cheese, and definitely milk if the cow has been milked yet. There might be porridge made from barley or oats, filling and warm. People eat with their fingers and wooden spoons. Forks haven't been invented yet, but honestly, who needs them? The day's work depends on the season. Let's say it's spring, so there's ploughing to be done. The family's ox is harnessed to an iron-tipped plough, one of those innovations that iron made possible, and you head to the fields. Ploughing is rhythmic work. The ox walks, the plough cuts through the earth, and you follow behind, keeping the plough steady and occasionally clearing rocks and roots from the blade. It's the kind of work that lets your mind wander, while your body does what it knows how to do. The smell of fresh turned earth is one of those scents that reaches something deep in human memory. It smells like possibility, like potential, like the promise that these seeds you're about to plant will become food. Celtic farmers know their land intimately, which fields flood in heavy rain, which dry out too quickly, and where the soil is richest. This knowledge isn't written down, it's handed down, with a child working alongside a parent, learning through doing. Back at the settlement, other people are engaged in their own tasks. Someone's weaving at the loom, the shuttle passing back and forth in a rhythm older than memory. The weaver is making a cloak, thinking about who will wear it, making it sturdy enough for winter, but not so heavy it can't be worn in spring. The wool has been spun by hand, which took weeks, and the weaving will take weeks more. Nothing is quick, but nothing is rushed either. A smith is working at his forge, and you stop to watch because smith work is always fascinating. Today he's making a knife, not an elaborate ceremonial piece, just a good practical knife for daily use. But even this simple knife will be beautiful, because beauty and functionality aren't separate concepts in Celtic thinking. Why make something ugly when you can make it pleasing to look at? The knife's handle will be carved with a simple pattern. The blade will be balanced and sharp. When someone uses this knife in 20 years, they'll still appreciate how well it fits the hand. Children are playing, always playing. They're racing sticks down the stream that runs past the village, building elaborate rules about which stick wins, and immediately arguing about whether that particular stick crossed the finish line first or second. Older children are helping with adult work, collecting eggs, watching the younger kids, learning to card wool, or helping the smith by pumping the bellows. Work and play blur together in childhood. Late afternoon, people start gathering. Celtic life is communal. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely exists. People cook together, eat together, work together, and talk together. The evening meal is the day's social event. Today, it's a stew made with leeks, beans, and a bit of salt pork for flavor. There's bread, dense and filling, probably a bit coarse by modern standards, but delicious when you're hungry from a day's work. As people eat, they talk. Someone tells a story about tracking a boar through the forest. Someone else complains about a neighbor's cow that keeps breaking through the fence and eating the barley. There's discussion about when to shear the sheep. Someone makes a joke that's probably been making people laugh for generations. Language flows around you, that distinctive Celtic lilt, words that sound like music. After the meal, as darkness falls and the fire is built up again, this is when the bard might begin. Bards are professionals, trained from childhood in the art of memory and verse. This particular bard knows hundreds of stories and thousands of lines of poetry. Tonight he's recounting the genealogy of the local chief, tracing his ancestry back 20 generations to a legendary hero who supposedly fought a giant. Everyone's heard it before, but that's not the point. The point is the hearing itself, the communal experience of sitting together in firelight while words weave pictures in the darkness. The bard's skill is in variation. He tells the same story differently each time, responsive to his audience, adding details or leaving them out, speeding up the boring parts and lingering on the good bits. This is living literature, literature that breathes and changes. It will never be fixed on a page, never be definitive. Each telling is unique, and that's the beauty of it. We need to talk about druids, but let's clear away some misconceptions first. Druids aren't mystical wizard types in robes performing magic under full moons. Well, they might be, But that's not the main point. Druids are intellectuals, priests, judges, teachers, astronomers, and keepers of cultural knowledge. They're the people who have spent 20 years or more memorizing Celtic lore, history, religious practice, and natural law. You're attending a legal dispute somewhere in Celtic Britain. Two farmers claim the same piece of land, both insisting their grandfather's grandfather cleared it and established ownership. There's no written deed, no property records. So how do you settle this? You call in a druid. The druid arrives, and he's older, with the kind of face that suggests he's seen everything and found most of it amusing. He listens to both farmers make their case. He asks questions about landmarks, about where certain old stones are, and about family histories. Then he closes his eyes for a long moment, accessing that vast internal library of memorized knowledge, and finally pronounces judgment based on precedent, on traditional law, and on how similar cases have been settled before. His judgment is binding, not because he has an army to enforce it, but because rejecting a druid's judgment would mean rejecting the entire system that holds society together. It would mean putting yourself outside the community, and in Celtic society, that's not survivable. The farmer who loses the dispute might grumble, but he accepts it because the alternative is unthinkable. Druids also handle religious matters, which in Celtic society means everything from blessing crops to interpreting omens to conducting sacrifices. The Celts worship many gods, most of whom are associated with natural features or human activities. There's a god of the forge, a goddess of the river, and deities associated with war, healing, fertility, and wisdom. These gods don't live on some distant mountain. They're here, in the landscape, in daily life. Certain places are especially sacred: springs where the water emerges from the earth, groves of ancient oaks, and hilltops where you can see forever. At these places, people leave offerings, coins thrown into the spring, weapons deliberately broken and buried, and valuable objects given to the gods with no expectation of return. Archaeologists, centuries later, will find these offerings and puzzle over why anyone would throw perfectly good swords into bogs. The answer is devotion and the creation of sacred space where the human and divine worlds touch. The Druids oversee the calendar too, determining when festivals should be held. The Celtic year is divided by 4 major festivals, marking the turning of the seasons. Samhain, in late October, is when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thin. Imbolc, in early February, marks the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, in May, celebrates fertility and growth. Lugnasad, in August, is the harvest festival. These aren't just parties, though they are parties. They're times when the community comes together to mark the passage of time, to remember the dead, to celebrate the living, and to acknowledge that they're part of something larger than themselves, part of the eternal cycle of seasons and years. The Druids also teach, taking on students who will study for decades to learn what the Druids know. These students memorize epic poems, legal codes, genealogies, astronomical observations, herbal medicine, and religious rituals. All of this without writing it down, because the Druids believe, perhaps rightly, that written words are dead words, fixed and unchanging, while memorized knowledge lives and breathes. There's something remarkable about a culture that can maintain such sophisticated knowledge without writing. It requires a different kind of mind, one trained from childhood to remember, to connect, to recall vast amounts of information and deploy it when needed. We've lost this capacity, mostly, in our written and now digital age, but the Druids possessed it, and it served Celtic society well for centuries. The year is 58 BCE, and everything is about to change. Gaius Julius Caesar has been appointed governor of Transalpine Gaul, and he's ambitious in that particularly Roman way, where ambitious means willing to conquer entire peoples to advance your political career. You're in a Gaulish village, and you've been hearing troubling news from the south. Roman armies, disciplined and relentless in a way that Celtic warriors aren't, have been moving through Gaul. They don't fight like Celts fight. Celts favor individual combat, champions stepping forward to duel, and warfare as a kind of deadly sport. Romans fight in formation, each soldier part of a larger machine, grinding forward with methodical efficiency. The Roman advance is marked by a strange mix of violence and administration. They destroy villages that resist, but they also build roads, establish markets, and bring Mediterranean goods, wine, olive oil, and fine pottery. Some Celtic nobles make deals with Rome, seeing opportunity in alliance. Others resist, and their resistance is crushed. The thing is, the Celts might have stopped Rome if they'd been unified, but unity was never the Celtic way. Each tribe makes its own decision. Some fight, some submit, and some try to play Rome off against rival tribes. Celtic political fragmentation, which worked fine in a world of other Celtic tribes, becomes fatal when facing an organized imperial power. You hear about the battle at Alesia, where the Gaulish leader Vercingetorix made a last stand. Caesar besieged him in a hill fort, and when a massive relief army arrived, Caesar built fortifications facing both inward and outward, simultaneously besieging Vercingetorix and defending against the relief force. It was a brilliant, brutal piece of military engineering. When it was over, Gaul was finished as an independent Celtic land. But here's the interesting part. Roman conquest doesn't erase Celtic culture. It transforms it. Latin becomes the prestige language, but people still speak Celtic at home. Roman gods are identified with Celtic ones in a kind of religious syncretism. Towns grow up where villages were, with Roman-style buildings and Celtic roundhouses side by side. Celtic nobles send their sons to study in Rome, and they come back speaking Latin and wearing togas, but they're still Celts underneath. In Britain, the process is similar but slower. Rome invades under Claudius in 43 CE. Britain becomes a province, but only the southern and eastern parts really Romanize. The north and west remain stubbornly Celtic. Hadrian eventually builds his wall, essentially admitting that some Celts simply aren't worth the trouble of conquering. Ireland never gets conquered at all. The Romans knew it was there. They called it Hibernia, but they never invaded. Maybe it seemed too far, too poor, too difficult. Whatever the reason, Celtic culture in Ireland continues uninterrupted, evolving on its own terms. This will prove important later. Let's visit Roman Britain around 150 CE in a town that was a Celtic village a century ago. The transformation is visible everywhere. There's a forum with stone columns where the market used to be. Roman-style houses with painted plaster walls stand beside traditional roundhouses. People wear both togas and traditional Celtic cloaks, sometimes in bewildering combinations. The local magistrate is a Celt whose grandfather fought the Romans. He has a Latin name now, but he still speaks the Celtic language at home. He's successfully navigated two worlds, keeping one foot in each culture. His children are learning Latin grammar and rhetoric, but also hearing old Celtic stories from their grandmother. This mixing, this cultural blending, is how the empire actually works at ground level. Not through erasure, but through adaptation. The Celts have given Rome more than they perhaps realize. Celtic metalworking techniques influence Roman craftspeople. Celtic cavalry tactics are adopted by Roman armies. The Celts' knack for making excellent beer spreads through Roman Britain. Wine is prestigious, but beer is cheaper, and many people prefer it anyway. Celtic art, with its curves and spirals, begins showing up in Roman mosaics and metalwork, disguised as decoration, but unmistakably Celtic in spirit. Language persists in place names. Rivers and hills keep their Celtic names even as Latin becomes the official language. Centuries later, these names will still be there, testifying to the people who named them. The Thames, the Severn, London itself. All Celtic names surviving in a Latin and later English-speaking world. In the countryside, far from Roman towns, Celtic life continues with minimal change. Farmers farm the same fields their ancestors farmed. Village life revolves around the same rhythms. The gods might have Roman names in official contexts, but everybody knows who they really are. The old stories are still told, though now they might include a heroic encounter with a Roman legion or two. The Druids have been officially banned. Rome distrusts organizations it can't control, but their knowledge persists in unofficial ways. Certain elders know the old laws. Certain poets remember the genealogies. Certain healers use the traditional herbs and treatments. The formal structure of Druidic education is gone, but the knowledge seeps through in 1,000 small ways. Now we're going to take a long step forward to the present day and go looking for the Celts in modern Europe. You might think they're gone, erased by Romans, by Germanic migrations, by medieval kingdoms and modern nations. But you'd be wrong. The Celts didn't disappear. They changed, adapted, and persisted. Start in Ireland, the one place that was never conquered by Rome. Irish Gaelic is still spoken, taught in schools, and used in daily life in some Western regions. The language has survived 1,500 years of external pressure. English rule, famine, and emigration. It's still here, a direct descendant of the Celtic languages spoken when Caesar was conquering Gaul. Irish mythology, written down by medieval monks, preserves stories that are fundamentally Celtic. Tales of heroes like Cú Chulainn, of the Tuatha De Danann, and of a world where the supernatural and everyday intersect. These stories were old when they were written down, having been passed orally for generations before anyone thought to record them. Move to Scotland, where Scottish Gaelic survives in the Highlands and Islands. It's endangered, certainly, but there are still communities where it's the first language, where children grow up speaking it at home. Celtic patterns still appear in modern Scottish art, in jewellery, and in textiles. The persistence is remarkable. Wales has maintained Welsh, another Celtic language, with perhaps the most success of all. Over 500,000 people speak Welsh today, and it has official status. Welsh television broadcasts exist, and Welsh language schools thrive. The language that was spoken when the Romans arrived is still spoken, evolved but recognizable. Brittany in northwestern France speaks Breton, brought there by Celts fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Breton is related to Welsh and Cornish, a piece of living linguistic history. It struggled in recent decades against French cultural dominance, but revival efforts are underway. Even in England, which is thoroughly Germanized linguistically, Celtic traces remain. Those place names we mentioned, dozens of rivers called Avon, meaning simply river in Celtic, and countless hills and towns with Celtic origin names. The landscape itself remembers. Celtic artistic motifs show up in surprising places. That spiral pattern you see in modern jewellery? Celtic. Those interlaced designs? Celtic, by way of early medieval Ireland. The Celts' artistic vocabulary has become part of European aesthetic heritage, often without people realizing its origin. Celtic festivals have persisted too. transformed but recognizable. Halloween is Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead, with a Christian veneer. May Day celebrations echo Beltane. These aren't conscious survivals. Few people dancing around a maypole think, I'm celebrating a Celtic fertility festival. But the continuity is there if you look for it. The political structure of ancient Celtic society, tribal, decentralized, and based on kinship and personal loyalty rather than abstract citizenship, has echoes in the clan systems that persisted in Scotland and Ireland into the modern era. The emphasis on hospitality, on elaborate gift-giving, and on the importance of one's word, these Celtic values shaped the culture of northwestern Europe in ways that are still visible. As we near the end of our walk through Celtic history, let's think about what this gentle civilization contributed to European culture, not through conquest or empire building, but through the quiet influence of their way of life. The Celts showed that you could have a sophisticated culture without cities, that you could maintain complex knowledge without writing, and that you could organize society around relationships rather than institutions. They demonstrated an approach to life that valued beauty for its own sake, that saw no division between the practical and the aesthetic, and that understood humans as part of nature rather than separate from it. Their art influenced everyone who came after. Those spirals and curves, that sense of flow and movement, that ability to make even a simple tool beautiful. This became part of European aesthetic sensibility. Medieval Irish manuscripts, with their elaborate interlaced patterns, are direct descendants of Celtic artistic traditions. The Book of Kells is a Celtic masterpiece, created 1,000 years after the classical Celtic period ended. The Celtic approach to storytelling, oral, flexible, participatory, shaped European narrative traditions. The medieval romances about King Arthur, that's Celtic storytelling filtered through French and English writers. The emphasis on heroes, on loyalty, on the tragic impossibility of perfection, these are Celtic narrative concerns. Celtic attitudes toward the natural world, the sense that the land itself is sacred, that certain places are holy, and that spirits inhabit the landscape. This animistic worldview persisted long after official Christianization. Holy wells, sacred groves, pilgrimages to hilltops. These practices continued with Christian rather than pagan explanations, but the underlying sensibility is Celtic. The Druids' approach to knowledge and the emphasis on memory and oral tradition shaped early medieval Irish Christianity in particular. Irish monks became famous for their learning, their manuscript illumination, and their preservation of classical texts. They carried this love of knowledge, learned from Druids, adapted to Christian purposes, back to continental Europe during the early Middle Ages, helping to preserve learning during difficult centuries. Celtic languages influenced the Romance languages, spoken in former Celtic territories. French, Spanish, and Portuguese all have Celtic substrate elements, words and grammar quirks that come from the Celtic languages spoken in these regions before Latin arrived. The influence is subtle but real, a linguistic ghost haunting the modern languages of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the Celts demonstrated a way of being European that wasn't Roman or Germanic, a third option, a different way of organizing society and thinking about the world. They showed that you could be sophisticated without being imperial, civilized without being militaristic, and cultured without building vast centralized states. As our hour together draws to a close, you're standing again in that misty clearing where we started. But now you're seeing it differently. You understand that this place, these people, isn't isolated or primitive. They're part of a vast cultural tradition that will spread across Europe and persist for millennia. The Celts never built an empire, never conquered distant lands, and never imposed their language and culture through military force. They simply lived, farmed, made beautiful things, told stories, and passed their culture from generation to generation. And that turned out to be enough. Not enough to avoid being conquered by Rome, perhaps, but enough to outlast Rome in other ways, to leave traces that remain visible 2,000 years later. When you visit Ireland and hear someone speaking Irish Gaelic, you're hearing a Celtic language. When you see Celtic patterns in jewelry or artwork, you're seeing an aesthetic tradition thousands of years old. When you encounter attitudes toward hospitality, storytelling, or the natural world in northwestern Europe, you're often encountering ideas that have Celtic roots. The Celts remind us that there are many ways to be civilized, many ways to build a culture, and many ways to live meaningfully. They remind us that beauty matters, that stories matter, that relationships matter, and that the land itself matters. They remind us that sometimes the loudest cultures in history, the ones that build the biggest monuments and conquer the most territory, aren't necessarily the ones with the most lasting influence. The Celtic civilization shaped Europe quietly, like water shaping stone, persistent and patient. And if you know how to look, you can still see their influence everywhere, hiding in plain sight, in place names and languages, in artistic motifs and cultural attitudes, and in the very landscape of northwestern Europe. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself in that Celtic village, with firelight flickering on roundhouse walls, the smell of wood smoke and cooking, and the sound of voices speaking a language old beyond measure, telling stories that will be told again tomorrow and the day after, and down through the years, persistent and gentle as rain, shaping the world through the simple act of continuing, of being, of remembering. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of ancient forests, spiral patterns, and the quiet wisdom of a people who knew that the best way to change the world is simply to live well in it. You stand at the edge of a vast oak forest in what will one day be called Gaul, though no one here knows that name yet. The year is somewhere around 500 BCE, and the concept of recording this date would seem as strange to the people around you as trying to capture smoke in your hands. There are no books here, no scrolls, no carved stone proclamations declaring the deeds of kings. Knowledge exists only in the minds of those who remember, passed from breath to breath, from one generation's lips to the next generation's ears. The morning mist hasn't fully lifted from the valley, and you can smell the wood smoke from the roundhouses scattered across the hillside. Each dwelling is a marvel of practical engineering. Circular walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs that shed rain like a duck's back, and doorways that always face east to greet the sun. The people who emerge from these homes move with the purposeful slowness of those who measure time by seasons rather than hours. There are no clocks here, no appointments to keep, and no schedules written in ink that might fade. In the center of the settlement, you notice a young man sitting cross-legged on a flat stone, his eyes closed, his lips moving silently. He's perhaps 14 or 15, at that awkward age where his limbs seem too long for his body. His name is Carantus, though you won't need to remember it. What matters is what he's doing, memorizing the lineage of his tribe's chieftain, going back 12 generations. He's been at it since dawn, repeating the names like a prayer. Vercingetorix, son of Divitiacus, son of Caturix, son of Ambiorix, and on, each name a link in a chain that connects the present to the shadowy past. You might wonder why anyone would bother with such an exercise when they could simply write it down. But the Celtic peoples of this time don't trust writing for important matters. They've seen Greek and Phoenician traders scratching symbols onto tablets, and they find the practice vaguely unsettling. How can something as alive as a person's name, with all its spoken music and breath, be reduced to dead marks on a surface? It seems almost disrespectful, like trying to preserve a thunderstorm in a jar. Besides, memory is a muscle, and in this world, it's the strongest muscle many people possess. The elderly woman grinding grain near the communal oven can recite every plant that grows within a day's walk and its use, which ones heal fevers, which ones ease childbirth, and which ones send you into dreams from which you never wake. The blacksmith hammering bronze into an intricate torque can tell you the precise composition of his alloy, passed down from his grandfather's grandfather, not in measurements, but in colors and sounds, the way the metal sings when it's ready, and the shade of orange that means the fire is hot enough. In this pre-literate world, your status isn't determined by how many scrolls you own or how many languages you can read. It's measured by what you can remember, what you can recite, and what you carry inside your head. And into this world, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of person is emerging. Someone who doesn't just remember practical things like genealogies and plant lore, but who has begun to remember everything. Abstract ideas, legal precedents, the movements of stars, the nature of the soul. Poetry that takes 3 days to recite properly. These people don't call themselves druids yet. That word will come later, probably derived from the roots for oak and knowledge, though etymology becomes fuzzy when languages are only spoken, never frozen in writing. Right now, they're simply the ones who know things, the ones you go to when you need to settle a dispute, or understand why the crops failed, or learn the proper way to honor the gods. You watch as Carantus finally opens his eyes, blinking in the strengthening sunlight. He's finished his recitation, and his mentor, an older man with silver threading through his dark hair, nods approval. The boy hasn't become a druid yet. He's barely begun. But he's taken the first step into a tradition that will, over the next few centuries, create the most sophisticated oral education system the ancient world has ever known. The settlement is waking up properly now. Children chase each other between the houses, their laughter sharp and bright in the morning air. A few dogs, lean and rangy, nose around for scraps. Someone is singing while they work, a tune without words that seems to mimic the pattern of whatever task they're performing. The rhythm of this place is different from what you're used to. Slower, more circular, returning always to familiar patterns like a spiral carved into stone. You notice that the silver-haired mentor has placed his hand on Carantus's shoulder and is leading him toward the edge of the settlement, where the forest begins in earnest. This is where the real education happens, not in any building, not at any desk, but walking through the woods, learning to read the landscape itself as if it were a book, which, in a sense, it is, the only book that matters. The forest swallows you in green shadow. Oak trees, ancient and thick-trunked, rise like pillars in a natural cathedral. Their branches interweave overhead, filtering the sunlight into a golden-green glow that makes everything feel slightly unreal, as if you've stepped sideways into a different world. Perhaps you have. The older man, his name is Segamaros, and he's been a druid for 30 years, walks with the careful pace of someone who notices everything. He pauses to examine a particular moss growing on the north side of a tree. He crouches to inspect a mushroom, then moves on without touching it. Young Carantus follows a few steps behind, trying to walk quietly, though fallen leaves crunch under his feet, no matter how carefully he places them. You learn, as you follow them deeper into the woods, that becoming a druid is nothing like any education system you've encountered before. There are no terms or semesters, no graduation ceremonies, Some students study for 20 years. A few exceptionally talented ones might complete their training in 12. Most who begin never finish at all, returning to their tribes to become skilled craftspeople or warriors or farmers, carrying with them a deeper knowledge than they started with, but not the full weight of druidic learning. Segomaros begins to speak, and you realize this is how it's done. Not lectures exactly, more like conversations with long pauses built in, spaces for the student to think, to question, to absorb. The first thing you must understand, he says, his voice low and measured, is that we are the memory of our people. Not just their past, but their present understanding of how the world works. When I die, everything I know dies with me, unless I've placed it safely in your mind and the minds of your fellow students. It's a sobering thought. No backup copies, no libraries to consult, just the fragile vessel of human memory, which can be destroyed by a fever or a blow to the head, or the simple erosion of age. They continue walking, and Segomaros points out a clearing where 5 paths meet. This is where we settled a boundary dispute last spring, he says. 2 families, both claiming the same grazing land, both with reasonable arguments. I'll tell you the case, and you'll remember it. Not just the outcome, but the reasoning. Because when a similar dispute arises 30 years from now, you'll need to recall how we thought through the problem. And so begins a recitation that takes most of an hour. The dispute itself wasn't particularly dramatic. No violence, no shouting, just 2 stubborn farmers convinced they were right. But the way Segomaros walked through the logic, considering ancient precedents, examining the land itself for clues about old boundaries, consulting the memories of the eldest tribal members, it was like watching someone solve an intricate puzzle where every piece was made of words and memory. Carantus listens with an intensity that makes his eyes water from not blinking enough. You can almost see him filing away each detail, creating mental hooks to hang the information on. The Druids, you realize, have developed elaborate memory techniques, associating facts with physical locations, creating vivid mental images, and using rhythm and rhyme to make information sticky in the mind. Later cultures will rediscover these methods and give them fancy names like method of loci. But here in the forest, they're simply the way knowledge is preserved. Days blur into weeks, and you watch the pattern of education unfold. There's no single subject that Carantus studies. Instead, everything is interconnected. A lesson about oak trees becomes a lesson about the sacred nature of certain groves, which becomes a lesson about proper ritual behavior, which becomes a lesson about the structure of the cosmos itself. The Druids see no separation between what you might call science, religion, law, and philosophy. It's all one vast web of understanding, and a true Druid must hold the entire web in their mind. You're present one afternoon when Segomaros tests Carantus on plant identification. They're sitting beside a stream, and the older Druid points to various growing things, asking for names and uses. Carantus does well with the common ones, the herbs for cooking, the plants for healing minor wounds. But then Segomaros points to a small, unremarkable plant with oval leaves. And this one. Carantus hesitates. You can see him searching his memory, trying to recall. Finally, he admits he doesn't know. Instead of scolding, Segomaros simply says, "Look at it. Really look. What does it tell you about itself?" The boy stares at the plant for a long time. He touches its leaves gently, feels their texture. He smells them. He examines where it's growing, in partial shade, near water, in soil that's neither too wet nor too dry. It's careful, he finally says. It doesn't want too much of anything. Balance. Segomaros smiles, the first time you've seen him show open pleasure in his students' progress. Yes, this is Salago. We use it for protection, for cleansing. But you've understood something more important, that every plant teaches you about the nature of existence itself. Balance, moderation, finding your right place in the world. This, you realize, is the heart of Druidic education. It's not just about accumulating facts, though the Druids accumulate a staggering number of facts. It's about developing a particular way of seeing the world, where everything is connected to everything else, where the small reflects the large, and where the same patterns repeat at every scale, from the growth of an acorn to the movement of the stars. The education happens everywhere, sometimes in the forest, sometimes at tribal gatherings, sometimes during the long winter nights when stories are shared around the fire. Carantus learns poetry, not simple songs, but elaborate compositions that can take hours to recite, filled with complex metaphors and layered meanings. He learns genealogy, not just of his own tribe, but of neighboring tribes, of legendary heroes, and of the gods themselves. He learns the calendar, how to predict the phases of the moon, when to expect the return of certain birds, and which days are favorable for important undertakings. And always, woven through everything, he learns the law. The Druids are the legal experts of their society, the walking repositories of precedent and tradition. They can recite hundreds of judgments and thousands of specific rulings, all organized in their minds through elaborate mnemonic systems. When Carantus is older, people will come to him with disputes, and he'll need to summon up the relevant cases instantly, without fumbling, without uncertainty. You watch one evening as Segomaros introduces Carantus to something new, the triad, a teaching device the Druids love. Everything, Segomaros explains, can be understood in threes. There are three foundations of wisdom: knowledge of the past, understanding of the present, and vision of the future. There are three qualities of a good judge: patience, impartiality, and memory. There are three dangers to learning: arrogance, haste, and distraction. The triads go on and on, hundreds of them, each one a nugget of wisdom compressed into an easily remembered form. Carantus will spend years memorizing these until he can produce the appropriate triad for any situation, any question, any problem that arises. As the seasons turn, you notice something interesting. Carantus isn't becoming duller from all this memorization, as you might expect. His mind is becoming sharper, more agile, and more capable of holding multiple ideas at once and seeing the connections between them. His memory is developing into something almost superhuman, able to recall conversations word for word from months ago and to summon up precise details of events he witnessed only once. This is what it means to become a druid, to transform your mind into a library, a courthouse, and a university, all wrapped in a single human skull. It's an enormous undertaking, and now you understand why most students don't complete it. The mental discipline required is extraordinary, maintained year after year, with no end in sight except the day when you're finally acknowledged as a full druid and can begin teaching students of your own. 10 years have passed, though you've barely noticed the time flowing by. Carantus is no longer a gangly teenager, but a man in his mid-20s, still studying, but now taking on more responsibilities. You find yourself at a tribal gathering, a massive assembly that happens 4 times a year when the moon is right and the weather permits. Hundreds of people have congregated in a natural amphitheater formed by a hillside. Families have traveled for days to be here, bringing disputes that need settling, questions that need answering, and grievances that require the wisdom of the druids. The gathering serves many purposes. social connection, religious observance, trade, and barter, but the most important function is judicial. You watch as Segomaros, now even more silver-haired than before, takes his place on a raised platform of earth. He's not alone. 6 other druids are with him, ranging in age from barely older than Carantus to a woman so ancient her face looks like weathered oak bark. They represent different tribes and different territories, but they all share the same training and the same vast body of memorized lore. The first case of the day involves a borrowed cow. A farmer claims his neighbor never returned the animal. The neighbor insists he did return it, but it wandered off before the first farmer saw it back in his field. It's the sort of petty dispute that could escalate into a blood feud if not handled properly. Both men state their cases, speaking clearly and without interruption. The druids listen with perfect attention, their faces neutral. When both sides are finished, Segomaros doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he closes his eyes for a long moment, searching his memory for relevant precedents. Then, he begins to speak. His voice carries across the hillside without shouting. He's trained for this and knows how to project without strain. In the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers, he begins, a similar case arose between 2 families of the Arverni. A borrowed horse, not a cow, but the principle remains the same. The druid Divisiacus ruled thus: when an animal is returned to common grazing land, rather than to an enclosed field, the responsibility for its safety passes back to the lender at the moment the borrower releases it in that place. However, the borrower must demonstrate that the return happened during daylight hours, when the lender could reasonably have seen the animal. He opens his eyes and looks at the 2 farmers. Can you show that you returned the cow during daylight? The borrower hesitates. It was evening, near dusk. Then the loss falls upon you. You should have kept the animal until morning or returned it directly to your neighbor's enclosure. The cow's value will be paid in kind, a heifer of equivalent age and quality, delivered before the next moon. The ruling is accepted without argument. This is the power of the druids. Their judgments carry weight, not because they're backed by force, but because everyone trusts in the vast accumulation of precedent and wisdom they represent. To argue with a druid's ruling would be to argue with the collected experience of generations. Case after case unfolds throughout the day. A boundary dispute that requires Segomaros to recite the exact wording of an agreement made 40 years ago, which he does without hesitation. A question of inheritance complicated by a second marriage and children from both unions. An accusation of theft that requires careful examination of the accused person's character and history. You notice something remarkable about how the druids work. They don't rely on written evidence because there isn't any, but they're not helpless without it. Instead, they call upon witnesses, examine the consistency of stories, and look for corroborating details. They understand human nature deeply, how people lie, how they rationalize, and how they remember events differently based on their own interests. Carantus sits slightly apart from the senior druids, observing everything. His role today is to remember these cases, to add them to the vast mental archive he's building. Years from now, he'll cite these very judgments when making his own rulings. Between cases, you notice the druids consulting with each other quietly. They're checking each other's memories, making sure important details haven't been forgotten or misremembered. This is another safeguard in their system. The law isn't held by a single person, but by the collective memory of the druidic class. If one druid is uncertain about a precedent, another can confirm or correct it. As the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, a more serious case comes before the assembly. A man has been accused of murder, not in hot blood during a fight, which would be serious enough, but through poison, which is considered particularly dishonorable. The accused maintains his innocence. There are no witnesses to the actual poisoning, only the suspicious death and some circumstantial evidence. The woman with the face like oak bark takes the lead on this case. Her voice is thin and reedy, but everyone strains to hear every word. She questions both the accuser and the accused with surgical precision, teasing out details, looking for inconsistencies. She asks about the victim's other enemies, about who would benefit from his death, about the type of poison suspected, and about who would have access to it. Finally, after what feels like hours, she pronounces her judgment. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. However, there are ways to determine truth when human testimony fails us. She looks at the accused man with eyes that seem to see right through him. You will undergo the ordeal of the sacred pool. If the gods find you innocent, the water will support you. If guilty, it will reject you. You feel a chill run down your spine. This is the other side of Druidic authority, their connection to the divine, their ability to call upon supernatural means of judgment when natural ones fall short. The accused man pales, but nods acceptance. To refuse would be to admit guilt in everyone's eyes. The actual ordeal will take place tomorrow, giving everyone time to prepare properly and to make the necessary offerings and prayers. But the Druid's word is already final. Whatever the outcome of the ordeal, it will be accepted as the truth revealed by higher powers. As the gathering disperses for the evening meal, you overhear conversations among the common people. They're not afraid of the Druids exactly, but they treat them with a respect that borders on reverence. The Druids are the ones who keep society functioning, who prevent disputes from becoming feuds, and who maintain the delicate balance of justice that allows different families and tribes to coexist without constant violence. Later, around the fire, you sit near enough to hear Segamaros speaking with Carantus about the day's cases. You saw how Moriana handled the murder accusation? He asks his student. Carantus nods. She admitted the limits of human knowledge. She knew when to call upon the gods. Exactly. We are wise, but we are not all-knowing. The hardest part of being a druid is knowing when you've reached the boundary of what logic and memory can determine. That's when ritual and divine judgment become necessary. He pokes at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. But never use the gods as a shortcut. Some druids, lazy ones, call for ordeals when a little more questioning would reveal the truth. The gods have their own business to attend to. We shouldn't bother them with matters we can sort out ourselves. It's a fascinating glimpse into the Druidic worldview, simultaneously deeply religious and surprisingly practical. The Druids believe absolutely in the reality of the gods and the spirit world, but they don't use that belief as an excuse for sloppy thinking. If anything, their connection to the divine seems to make them more rigorous in their reasoning, not less. The fire burns low, and people begin drifting toward their temporary shelters. Tomorrow will bring more cases, more judgments, and more demonstrations of the Druids' role as the living law of their people. But for now, there's only the quiet crackle of cooling embers and the stars wheeling overhead in patterns the Druids have memorized as thoroughly as they've memorized everything else. Years continue to accumulate like fallen leaves. Carantus is now fully recognized as a Druid in his own right, though still considered young at 35. You follow him on a journey to a sacred grove deep in territory controlled by the Carnutes tribe in the very heart of Gaul. This grove, it's whispered, is the center of the Druidic world, where the most important gatherings take place and the deepest mysteries are contemplated. The journey takes weeks of walking through forests and across rivers, staying with various tribes along the way. Each time Carantus is recognized as a druid, he's treated as an honored guest, given the best food, and given the warmest spot by the fire. But he never takes advantage of this hospitality. You notice he's scrupulously fair in his dealings, careful not to favor one family over another, mindful that his presence alone can shift the dynamics of a community. The sacred grove, when you finally reach it, is nothing like you expected. There's no grand architecture, no monuments, just a clearing among ancient oaks, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people linking hands to encircle one. The ground is covered in thick moss that muffles footsteps. A spring bubbles up from rocks at one edge, its water clear and cold. Dozens of druids have gathered here from across the Celtic world. They've come from Britannia and Hibernia to the west, from as far south as the lands near the Middle Sea, and from the eastern territories where Celtic and Germanic tribes mix and blur. Despite their different origins, they can all understand each other, not just because they speak related languages, but because they share the same training, the same body of knowledge, and the same ways of thinking about the world. You settle in to observe what happens over the next several days. There are discussions, debates, and exchanges of information. A druid from Britannia shares astronomical observations made over the past year. One from Hibernia recites a newly composed poem about the death and rebirth of the sun god. An elderly druid from the south shares legal precedents from his region, which the others memorize and discuss, considering whether to adopt them in their own territories. But the deepest conversations happen in small groups, with druids sitting in circles of 3 or 4, talking about the nature of reality itself. You position yourself near Carantus and 2 other druids around his age, listening as they explore questions that have no easy answers. One of them, a woman named Visucia with sharp eyes and quick gestures, poses a question. If the soul is immortal and passes from one life to another, as we teach, then what is the purpose of virtue? Why should we concern ourselves with justice and honor in this life if we'll simply be reborn into another? Carantus considers this carefully before responding. Perhaps the question assumes wrongly that virtue is only valuable if it earns us something beyond itself. A tree doesn't produce acorns in order to achieve immortality. It simply does what a tree does. Maybe humans should practice justice because that's what humans do when they're truly themselves, not because it leads to reward. The third druid, a man named Maggiorix, shakes his head. But trees don't have a choice. We do. And choice implies purpose and direction. I think the soul carries the imprint of its deeds from one life to the next. Act with honor now, and you'll be born into circumstances that reflect that honor. Act with cruelty, and you'll find yourself in a life shaped by that cruelty. The conversation continues for hours, weaving through questions of fate and free will, the nature of the gods, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. What strikes you most is the lack of dogma. The druids don't have a fixed scripture they must defend. Instead, they approach these questions like explorers mapping unknown territory, using reason and observation and intuition to feel their way toward understanding. You learn, as you listen to multiple such conversations over several days, that the druids have developed a sophisticated philosophy of nature. They see the cosmos as fundamentally alive, animated by the same force that moves through humans and animals and plants. Everything is connected in a vast web of relationships. The health of the land affects the health of the people. The actions of the people affect the land. The gods are not separate from nature, but are nature itself expressing intelligence and will. This philosophy has practical implications. When a druid advises a tribe about where to plant crops or when to move cattle to new pastures, they're not just applying agricultural knowledge. They're thinking about the whole system, the soil, the water, the weather patterns, the needs of wild animals, and the spiritual significance of particular locations. It's a holistic approach that you suspect is often more effective than the narrow focus of specialists. One evening, as the sun sets and long shadows stretch across the grove, the oldest druid present, a man so ancient no one can remember when he wasn't old, begins to speak about the nature of time. His voice is barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the grove, everyone can hear. Time is not a river, he says. That's what the Romans think, with their calendars and their history books. Time is a spiral, always returning but never quite the same. The seasons repeat, but each spring is different from the last spring. We celebrate the same festivals our ancestors celebrated, but we are not our ancestors. We carry their memories, we speak their language, we honor their gods, but we are ourselves here, now, in this particular turning of the spiral. He pauses, and in the silence, you can hear the spring trickling and a bird calling from the darkening forest. This is why we don't write things down, he continues. Writing tries to fix time, to make it stand still. But time can't stand still. Knowledge must be alive and must change and grow with each person who holds it. When I teach you something, I don't give you dead words on a page. I give you living words that will change inside you, that you'll understand differently at 40 than you did at 20, differently at 60 than you did at 40. It's a beautiful articulation of something you've been sensing throughout your time among the Druids. Their entire system is based on the idea that knowledge is not a thing to possess, but a living process to participate in. Each Druid is not just a container of information, but an active interpreter, constantly reweaving the threads of tradition into patterns that make sense for their particular time and place. The gathering in the sacred grove lasts for 3 full cycles of the moon. During this time, the Druids make collective decisions about important matters. They agree on adjustments to the calendar. They discuss whether certain new legal precedents should be adopted widely. They compose poetry together, with different Druids contributing verses, the whole thing memorized by everyone present so they can carry it back to their home territories. You realize this is how the Druidic class maintains coherence across vast distances. These periodic gatherings allow them to synchronize their knowledge, to ensure that a Druid in Britannia and a Druid in Gaul are working from roughly the same foundation of law and custom and wisdom. It's an elegant solution to a problem that literate societies solve with written codes and libraries. How to maintain consistency of knowledge when you're spread across an entire continent. As the gathering finally disperses and Druids begin their journeys home, you notice an atmosphere of quiet satisfaction. They've done their work. They've strengthened the bonds of their shared tradition. They've passed on knowledge and received knowledge in return. And now they'll carry all of it in their heads back to their people, the living libraries returning to their shelves. The wheel of time keeps turning, but you've stopped paying close attention to its revolutions. Decades have blurred past. Carantus is now an old man, white-bearded and stiff in his movements. The world has been changing around him in ways both subtle and dramatic. Roman influence has been creeping northward like frost, not through military conquest yet, but through trade and cultural exchange. You've seen Roman merchants in Celtic settlements, their short tunics and clean-shaven faces standing out among the mustached warriors in their trousers and cloaks. They bring wine and olive oil and pottery, and they take away tin and gold and slaves. They also bring something else, the written word carved into stone and scratched onto wax tablets. a technology that both fascinates and disturbs the Celtic peoples who encounter it. Some younger druids have learned to read and write Latin, though they keep this skill quiet, aware that it goes against druidic tradition. The prohibition against writing sacred knowledge remains firm, but you can sense it weakening at the edges. The world is becoming more complex. The network of tribes and alliances harder to keep straight without records. Some druids are beginning to wonder whether the old ways can survive contact with Roman civilization. You're with Carantus one afternoon when a delegation arrives from a neighboring tribe. They've brought a legal dispute so complex, it's taken 3 of them to explain all the relevant facts. It involves a marriage, an inheritance, a broken contract, an accusation of fraud, and a counterclaim of slander. The threads of the case are so tangled that just understanding the question takes most of the day. Carantus listens with the patience of long practice, occasionally asking questions to clarify a point. Then he sits in silence for what feels like an hour, his eyes closed, sorting through the vast archive of precedents in his mind. When he finally speaks, his judgment is clear and detailed, citing cases from 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and even one from his teacher's time that seems remarkably relevant. The delegation accepts his ruling with obvious relief. As they're leaving, one of them, a young warrior with bright, curious eyes, asks Carantus something you haven't heard before. Honored druid, the Romans have libraries where all their laws are written down. Anyone can read them. Anyone can know what the law says. Why don't we do the same? Wouldn't it be easier? Carantus regards the young man with an expression that might be sadness or might be amusement. "Come walk with me," he says, and leads the warrior away from the settlement into the hills where the evening light is turning everything golden. You follow at a distance, just close enough to hear their conversation. "You ask about the Roman way," Carantus begins. "They write everything down. This is true. But what happens when the words on the page don't quite fit the situation at hand? The Romans have judges who interpret the written law, but those interpretations become rigid and fixed. Our way is different. Every case I judge, I bring to bear not just the letter of our traditions, but the spirit of them. I can weigh circumstances, consider intentions, and make adjustments based on what serves justice rather than what serves the written word." They walk in silence for a while. Then Carantus continues. "More than that, writing changes how we think. When knowledge is written down, it becomes separate from the knower. It's out there, on the page, dead and unchanging. But when knowledge lives in memory, it stays alive. It grows. It adapts. Each time I recite a law or a precedent, I make it new again. I put my understanding into it. The law isn't just words. It's a living tradition that breathes through those of us who carry it." The young warrior seems to be struggling with this concept. "But what happens when you die? Won't all your knowledge die with you?" "Of course not," Carantus replies gently. "I have students, as my teacher had students. They're memorizing everything I know, just as I memorized everything my teachers knew. Some of it will be lost in the transfer. That's inevitable. But some of it will be improved, refined, and added to. The tradition will continue, but it will also evolve. This is how it should be." They've reached a high point overlooking the valley, and they stand there watching the sun sink toward the horizon. You can see smoke rising from a dozen settlements scattered across the landscape, each one a small cluster of round houses where people live and work and dream, largely unchanged from how they lived generations ago. But you know that this world is ending. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. The Romans are coming, and not just as traders. Their legions are already conquering territories to the south and east. Within a generation, much of the Celtic world will be absorbed into the Roman Empire. The Druids will be persecuted, their groves cut down, and their traditions suppressed. The oral knowledge they've preserved for centuries will be scattered, and much of it will be lost forever. Yet standing here in the evening light, listening to Carantus explain the philosophy behind his life's work, you understand that something important did happen here. For several centuries, an entire civilization functioned without writing, developing sophisticated systems of law and education and philosophy entirely through the power of human memory. The Druids proved that literacy isn't the only path to complex thought, that oral cultures can achieve depths of understanding that rival anything written down. Years pass, and you're still with Carantus when the end finally comes. Roman legions under Julius Caesar have invaded Gaul, and they're methodically crushing all resistance. Caesar's soldiers have orders to kill Druids on sight. He understands that they're the glue holding Celtic society together, and removing them will make conquest easier. Carantus is too old to run, and besides, he wouldn't if he could. On his last day, he gathers his students around him in a grove that hasn't yet been found by Roman soldiers. There are 5 of them, ranging in age from 20 to 40, each one carrying in their head a portion of the vast knowledge Carantus has accumulated over his lifetime. Listen carefully, he tells them, his voice weaker than it once was, but still clear. What we've preserved will not survive unchanged. The Romans will try to destroy it, and they'll succeed in destroying much. But memory is harder to kill than they imagine. Our language will change. Our gods will be given Roman names. Our laws will be mixed with Roman law, but something will remain. He looks at each student in turn. Some of you will survive by hiding who you are. You'll become advisors to Roman governors and teachers in Roman schools. You'll seem to assimilate. But inside, you'll carry these traditions forward. Your children will hear the old stories. Your students will learn the old ways of thinking, even if they don't know that's what they're learning. It's the last teaching any of them receive from him. The next day, Roman soldiers find the grove. But by then, the students have scattered, each carrying with them fragments of a tradition that will, against all odds, survive in hidden forms, in folk practices, in story and song, and in ways of thinking about the natural world that persist long. After the Druids themselves are gone, you drift forward through time one last time, to a period after the Druids, after the Romans, after empires have risen and fallen and been forgotten. You find yourself in a medieval monastery in Ireland, watching a monk carefully copying an old manuscript. The manuscript contains stories about ancient heroes and gods, tales that were once memorized by Druids and passed down through generations before finally being written down. The monk doesn't know he's preserving Druidic tradition. He thinks he's just recording interesting old stories. But in those stories, embedded like seeds in amber, are ways of thinking about the world that the Druids would recognize, the interconnection of all things, the spiral nature of time, and the wisdom found in wild places. You realize this is the legacy, not grand monuments or written texts, but ideas that seeped into the culture so deeply they became invisible, assumed, simply the way people thought. The Druids shaped the imagination of Europe in ways that are impossible to quantify, teaching people to see forests as sacred, to value memory and oral tradition, and to understand that knowledge isn't just facts, but wisdom lived and breathed. As you watch the monk work, his quill scratching across parchment in a quiet scriptorium, you feel yourself beginning to drift. The weight of sleep is pulling at you, soft and insistent. The candle on the monk's desk flickers, and the shadows on the walls seem to dance with patterns you almost recognize. Spirals and circles, the geometry of Celtic art. the visual language of a people who knew that some truths can't be written down, but must be experienced, remembered, and carried in the heart. The candle dims further. The scratching of the quill fades to silence, and you slip finally into sleep, carrying with you the memory of a world where knowledge lived only in minds, where wisdom was passed from breath to breath, where the keepers of tradition walked through oak forests, memorizing the laws of earth and sky, the slow, steady rhythm of druids becoming, being, enduring in ways both lost and found, forgotten and remembered, as eternal as memory itself.